Thank you to the Tewksbury Library for sponsoring the event. And thank you all for participating. So I've been living with Ben for a couple of years, researching this book I'm writing. As Robert said, it's a book about Ben Franklin's legacy. What I'm trying to get at is how he's seen today, how he's interpreted, how he's understood, how he's mythologized. And I'm still deep into the subject, into the research. I've had to pause some of the work because of coronavirus, but I'm still doing some of the archival research as much as I can. And based on what I've learned, I'd like to share a few thoughts with you about Ben's legacy, and especially how he relates to the current circumstances. I don't mean just coronavirus. I mean in the public debate about various issues. So my topic is, as Robert mentioned, Benjamin Franklin, icon for our troubled, Benjamin Franklin's legacy, icon for our troubled times. I've been asked to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I'd like to hear your questions and comments. They're crazy questions, as Robert said, because they won't be reserved for posterity. So you can ask anything you want, and I'll try to answer. And what I'd like to cover is first, I'll give you a very quick sketch of Franklin's biography. Robert mentioned some of aspects of that. And then I'd like to ask how Franklin has been quoted in contemporary times, how he's been exploited politically, especially, and during the debate on President Trump's impeachment, as well as the controversy over coronavirus. So first, a biographical thumbnail. Some of you probably know much of this. The outlines, I'll just go through it briefly. Franklin was born in Boston, January the 17th of 1706, in humble circumstances. His father, Josiah, was a candle maker. He was the 15th of 17 children born to Josiah by two wives. Ben had only 2 years of formal education, and he was apprenticed at age 12 to his older brother, James. It was a 9-year apprenticeship, and his brother and Ben really didn't get along very well, and James was a harsh taskmaster. And Franklin chafed under those circumstances, so he bolted. He left Boston. He fled his apprenticeship, violating the terms of his apprenticeship, and wound up in Philadelphia. He was virtually penniless when he arrived in Philadelphia, knew no one, and had to try to make it, how to survive really on his own. So the rest of his life, you can divide into, and this is what I'd like to cover to some extent, you can divide into 3 stages of accomplishment in remarkably varied domains. And in each of them, and this is one thing you probably know about Franklin, but in each of them, he achieved extraordinary success. So in one stage, he was, after arriving in Philadelphia in relatively short order, he was a prosperous printer, publisher, writer, best known, I think, commonly for Poor Richard's Almanac. Another stage sort of overlapped with his business success. He was a civic leader in Philadelphia, and he compiled a stunning record in launching civic institutions. He started the first fire brigade, the first lending library in the country. He was instrumental in starting a hospital, and the school that today is known as University of Pennsylvania, and many other things. How did he do it? Well, he did it by a lot of finesse. He was remarkably political when he had to be, and also trying to give a lot of other people credit for everything he was trying to do. In the next stage, he was a world-renowned scientist. He quit his business, his printing business, at the age of 42 to devote himself to scientists, and became world-renowned, especially in the field of electricity. Also a noted inventor. You probably are familiar with some of his inventions, many of which survive today. He invented the lightning rod, bifocal glasses, Franklin stove. All those things are still around. And in his final stage, he was a diplomat. Well, he also, along the way, served as president of the legislature in Pennsylvania, the assembly, and in other such political offices, the nation's first postmaster general. But as a diplomat, he served first in London and then in Paris, with more success in Paris than in London. Those are long stories, and I won't go into those in much detail. So if you try to understand why Franklin was really illustrious, one way to summarize it is he was one of 6 people to sign the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. And he was the only person to sign all 4 of the founding documents of the United States. Those 2, as well as the Treaty of Alliance with France and the Treaty of Paris with Great Britain to settle the Revolutionary War. So I have to say a word or two about his family circumstances. He was never married. He had a common law union with a woman named Deborah. The reason they never married was she had been married before, and her husband abandoned her and disappeared. And so there was no way for her to obtain a divorce in those days. They were married for quite some time. The civil union happened in about 1730. No one's sure the exact date. And she died before he did. She died in 1774. So they were together for a very long time. It's interesting to note, though, that what kind of marriage they had. It was, in a lot of ways, it was more of a business arrangement than it was the kind of typical marriage. I use the word marriage, knowing that it wasn't really a formal marriage. A business arrangement, and she was enormously helpful to him in building his company, his printing company, and later in running the household in many ways. But I think there was a great deal of affection between them. But he was away. This is an example of how unusual the marriage was. He was away for 15 of the last 17 years of her life. He was in London for that period. He died in Philadelphia. Oh, I should say that they had 2 children, a son, Francis, who died at age 4 of smallpox, and a daughter, Sarah, who survived, both of them. Franklin brought a son to the Union, to the civil union. His name is William. There's a whole story about William, which I don't have time to cover now. But he was a son born out of wedlock, and it's a mystery to this day who his mother was. Some people speculate it was Deborah, but there's no real good evidence to point to anyone as having been William's mother. Now I'd like to turn more to the heart of my talk. First, I'd like to ask you to think about for a moment how Franklin is quoted in contemporary times. Many of you probably know quotes off the top of your head. He's such a part of the lexicon, the American lexicon, that when you hear them, it's a little bit like Yogi Berra or Mark Twain or something. They resonate, and you think Franklin's. So I went to Bartlett's to see how important he is, his quotes figure in Bartlett's. And he accounts for 2 1/4 pages in Bartlett's. And I looked at those, and I picked out just the 3 that I like, and I'll just give as examples of his sort of clever, snappy aphorisms that he's so well known for. These are 3, and you probably have heard these. It's early to bed, early to rise, makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. I happened to bump into a neighbor of mine early one morning when I was out walking, and he was out walking. This is an old guy, a retired doctor. And I said, well, you're up early today. And he said, early to bed, early to rise, work like hell and advertise. So that was his version of Franklin's adage. Another one in Bartlett's is, God helps them that helps themselves. And the third one I like is, keep your eyes wide open before marriage, half shut afterwards. So I also looked at the other sections in Bartlett's about the founding fathers, and I was curious to see how they rate. So Jefferson, 4.5 pages. Adams 2, Washington 1, Hamilton 1/2, James Madison less than 1/2 page. So Ben does pretty well by Bartlett's. How is he memorialized? So if you look around the landscape and you wonder, and how much is Franklin with us now? How important is his name, his image, his words, other than the quotations, his words, other than the aphorisms, his words, his many words that he published? Well, there is no monument to Franklin on the National Mall or in West Potomac Park, where you'll find Washington and Jefferson, Madison, Lincoln, FDR, Martin Luther King. He hasn't made it there yet, but you will find his image on a $100 bill. I don't know how often you have those or if you've ever noticed. And if you Google the name Benjamin Franklin, how many hits would you expect to find? 164 million hits for Ben. What about a Broadway musical? Has there ever been one about Franklin? There was. There was one in 1964, and the title was Ben Franklin in Paris, and it opened in October, folded 6 months later in April, and it wasn't a big success. Nothing like Hamilton, which was running on Broadway until COVID-19 stopped it. It's interesting that Lin-Manuel Miranda, when he was working on the score for Hamilton, originally wrote some lyrics about Franklin. And he riffed off of Franklin in Paris. And I'll give you just a little swatch of some of the lyrics that he wrote. Took some lightning, a kite, and a fat brass key, and they're putting up streetlights in gay Paris. Well, that wound up on the cutting room floor. Miranda didn't think that it really worked as a part of the whole of the Hamilton script. How many cities are there in the United States named for Franklin? Well, there are 8 of them. And there's one pretty close to us. I don't know where you folks all are, but if you're in Massachusetts, there's one here. And it was founded, Franklin, Massachusetts, in 1776. And the town leaders said they would name it for Franklin if he would donate a bell for the municipal meeting hall. Franklin was obviously a well-known figure and known to be prosperous, and they thought that he would be a person who would be quite willing to send them a bell. But instead he sent books And he wrote the town founders. He said, sense is preferable to sound. So what about museums? How many museums are there devoted to Franklin and his legacy? Well, I know of 3. You may know of something that's escaped me, and if so, I'd like to hear about it in the question session. There's one in Philadelphia, which is part of the Independence National Historical Park. It's probably, I would say, it is definitely the largest and most prominent, most important of the museums. It's underground. It's on the site where Franklin and Deborah built a house. They never actually lived there together, but he lived there once he returned to Philadelphia after his stint in Paris. There's a second museum in London. It's at 36 Craven Street, around the corner from Trafalgar Square, if you know London. And that Craven Street is where Franklin lived for 16 years, starting in 2 sojourns, starting in 1767 and ending in 1775. There's a third one that I call a museum. It's really not a museum dedicated to Franklin. It has a lot to say about Franklin. And it's on Staten Island, at the tip of the island in a little town called Teutoburg. There's a story there. It's known as the Conference House. And in 1776, the Revolutionary War was not going well for the revolutionaries. George Washington's army was vastly outnumbered by the British troops, and Washington's army was routed from Brooklyn the month before. And this conference house meeting, I should have said the conference house meeting was on September the 11th of 1776. The month before, Washington's troops were routed by the British in Brooklyn. And so the feeling was among the British that this was a good time to ask the revolutionaries to sue for peace, because they must be reeling from this defeat and know that their odds were very much against them. So they proposed to the Continental Congress that there'd be a negotiations at this conference house. And the idea was that they would try to negotiate an end to the war, and that the Continental Congress would be open to some kind of deal. Well, what happened was the Congress chose 3 delegates, Franklin, John Adams, and a guy named Edward Rutledge. And they met with Admiral Richard Lloyd Howe, who was the commander of the British naval forces. Negotiations came to naught because the British were unwilling, totally opposed to recognizing American independence, and that was a sine qua non for the Americans. So how else is he memorialized? Well, one of the more interesting ways, and this is not evident a way that he is memorialized. It's not as evident in the sense that there's no building or monument in his memory. But one of the more interesting ways is there's been an enormous effort underway to collect all his papers and publish them, all his writings. And it's at Yale University. It started in 1954. And Yale has published now 43 volumes of his writings. They're still not finished. They expect to publish another 4 volumes comprising about the 30,000 writings of Franklin's that are known to be extant. And it's required an enormous effort to track down and anthologize, publish those writings. There are countless statues, busts, plaques in tribute to Franklin. They're all over the place. They're all over this country. They're in Europe. I don't have time to go into that. I was going to tell you, but I think if so, I'm going to run over on my time. But I think there are three at the University of Pennsylvania. There's one that I bumped into at the Mazarin Library, which is part of the Académie Française, a bust of him there. And there are many, many more. That's one of the things I'm trying to do, is find the ones that are most interesting, and I'll write about some of them in this book. In Boston, close by, you probably know that there's a park and zoo named for Franklin. There's a story there. There's a bust of him at 17 Milk Street, which is his birthplace and where he lived in the early days of his life. It's on the south side of the Old South Meeting Church, Old South Meeting House. And there's something in Boston called the Franklin Institute of Technology. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's an intriguing story. Very briefly, Franklin created a trust as a codicil to his will. A year before he died, he wrote this codicil. By the terms of the trust, he was going to leave 1,000 pounds sterling to two cities, to Boston and to Philadelphia. Well, by various twists and turns, the money for Boston, which originally was intended for the first 100 years to make loans to men. In those days, there were men who were doing it, apprentices who were ready to set up in business as tradesmen, so these would be what we call today many microfinance loans. And at the end of the first 100 years, some of the money, the residual money, was to pay for public works in Boston as well as in Philadelphia. Well, that portion of the money financed the creation of what's now known as the Franklin Institute of Technology. It awards 2-year associate degrees to people in vocational and technical fields. The people who receive the education at the Franklin Institute of Technology are almost entirely people from low income backgrounds, and vast majority of them are minorities, which, although they're not loans to apprentices who are struggling to get started in business, I think it's somewhat in the spirit of what Franklin had in mind. So now let's look at more of what I really would like to you to take from this talk tonight. And that is how Franklin most figures into the public discourse of today. And more specifically, how his name and his words are being exploited politically in our day. So let's start with a look at how Franklin's name cropped up during the debate over President Trump's impeachment. So there's a backstory that I have to tell you before I can get to that. And it's one of the more famous stories about Franklin. I would think you're familiar with this story. At the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention of 1787, Franklin, who was then old and frail, was tottering out of what was then called the Pennsylvania State House, now Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And a woman confronted him and she shouted, "Doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And in his rejoinder, both witty and ominous, Franklin replied, "A republic if you can keep it." Well, those words, a republic if you can keep it, figured into the debate over impeachment. Interestingly, it bookended the Democrats' case on impeachment. So in the House, Speaker Nancy Pelosi opened her remarks by recounting the story of what happened and when Franklin emerged from the Constitutional Convention. And then in the Senate, Adam Schiff did the same thing, very much the same thing. quoted the words to conclude his passionate appeal for conviction of Trump on the articles of impeachment. And I'll read you just a little bit of what Schiff had to say. After telling that story, he added, "A fair trial, an impartial consideration of all the evidence against the president is how we keep our republic." It wasn't just on one side of the aisle that you heard those words about Franklin having said, "You can have a republic and you can keep it." It was on the Republican side as well. I'll give you one example. There were many others who quoted those lines. Representative Ben Cline, a Republican of Virginia, warned that the republic was imperiled by the impeachment proceedings against the president, deploring what he called, and here I quote, "the misuse of the constitutional power of impeachment for one party's political gain." The story was repeated so often that it set off a flurry of tweets. One tweeter proposed a drinking game every time someone quoted Ben Franklin's "if you can keep it" adage. And every time someone heard that, they were supposed to take a drink. It prompted another tweeter to warn any players of that drinking game risk having their livers fall out. Then there's the controversy over various issues related to coronavirus. And guess what? Ben's words have been trotted out there once again. So again, I have to give you a little backstory. Upon completing the Declaration of Independence, the signatories knew that they had just committed treason against King George III. Well, treason was a hanging offense. And despite the grave threat, Franklin thought that he would try to unify all the signatories because he thought there was a grave danger that if they splintered, that it would undo this declaration that they had just signed. And he couldn't resist the play on words, the play on the word "hang." So then, he implored his fellow signatories this way, and you probably have heard this many times: "We must hang together, or we shall surely hang separately." So there was an op-ed article that caught my eye in the Washington Post last month by a conservative columnist, Henry Olson. And he argued that the fate of Republican candidates in the election this year is inevitably closely tied to Trump's success at the polls. Olson said that the Republican candidates for Congress should try to compensate for Trump's unpopularity. The polls have showed him somewhat sinking in some of the polls, especially maybe because of his response to the COVID-19 crisis. And Coleman said, we have to prop up the president by emphasizing his positive qualities, making the case for his reelection, because if we don't, if he goes down, we go down with him. And there was the quote. You can just say it to yourselves if you want. We must hang together, and so on. I also noticed a letter to the Richmond Times-Dispatch. The letter editor a couple of weeks ago proposed higher taxes on the wealthy to pay for corona-related relief. Why? As a symbol of the country pulling together, the wealthy doing its part to unify the country. The letter writer said the whole country must rise to this occasion. And she buttressed her report, that's right, by quoting Franklin's line, "We must hang together, but we shall surely hang separately. You'll see some more of that, I promise you. So now I'd like to talk about the next sort of broad subject that I want to cover, and that is how, more specifically, how Franklin's legacy speaks to the issues of the day, namely the issues surrounding the coronavirus crisis that we're facing. And there are 4 points of intersection that I'd like to highlight. The first is his uncanny instinct in understanding how infections are spread. In his day, it was a common wisdom that colds were caused by being outside in chilly weather or in damp or cold air, or wearing wet clothes. That was the idea in those days. But Franklin didn't accept anything like that. He had to do his own thinking about it, his own observation. And he noted that people tend to get more colds in the winter than they do in the summer. And he derived from that observation the idea that when people are shut up in confined spaces, that they're more likely to spread an infection among themselves by breathing on one another, which is what he said. So it exemplifies Franklin's approach to the phenomena around him, where he brought his keen eye, his empirical eye, to bear on everything happening around him. And that scientific truth about how infection is spread, of course, it applies to the advice we're now hearing about how to protect ourselves from coronavirus, to stay outdoors as much as possible rather than indoors with close to other people. Second way that I would like to mention Franklin in the context of coronavirus is his image as a paragon of frugality. I had intended to go on some length about why he has this image for frugality, but I don't think I have time to do that. I'll just give you one thought about that. It's so many of his adages, and one of his most famous books, A Way to Wealth, one of his most famous adages in there is a penny saved is a penny earned. I mean, that's the kind of thing that has so identified Franklin with frugality. And frugality, once again, is very much a matter on people's minds because of the economic distress so many people are feeling in this crisis. I would wager that you're going to hear Ben Franklin's name and hear him associated with frugality in that context as this crisis unfolds. Just a very brief aside there. Franklin had that image of frugality, and it was well justified for the first early part of his life. But in later life, he actually discovered a certain amount of luxury in London and Paris. He developed an interest in fine food. He shipped china and flatware and crystal home to Deborah in Pennsylvania. He collected over 1,000 bottles of wine when he was in France, including champagne and sherry and various other things. So he was frugal when he had to be, and he liked the image of frugality, but when he had an opportunity to enjoy things that he could afford, he seized that moment. There's a third way in which Franklin's legacy pertains to COVID-19. So Franklin personified the 18th century American Enlightenment, which was emerging in Philadelphia and in other parts of America when Franklin was coming of age. And for him, It meant, the spirit of enlightenment meant looking not to religion or politics for truth, but to scientific inquiry, to evidence-based inquiry, empirical study. And that is indeed how he approached the phenomenon of lightning. It was thought that lightning was a punishment from God, that it was not something that man could control. And then there was the famous kite experiment where Franklin showed that lightning was actually an expression of electricity, a force that humans could tame, if not entirely control, hence the lightning rod and so on. He brought the same scientific rigor to the subject of vaccines. In the 18th century, there were periodic outbreaks of smallpox. As I mentioned, his son died of smallpox. Doctors were experimenting with a controversial method of dealing with smallpox. They were taking the liquid, the pus from smallpox sores, and inoculating unaffected people, not affected people, because they discovered that often, if people survived, they developed an immunity to smallpox. Well, Franklin was aware of these medical discoveries, and he studied the statistics and tried to determine whether more people would survive if they were inoculated with smallpox than if they weren't. And he did that calculation and decided that more people would survive, and therefore he became a vigorous advocate of vaccination. Now, typically, strictly speaking, that style of inoculation was not a vaccine. A vaccine is, of course, when it doesn't make you sick, it protects you from some disease. Today, we are already hearing from some people who say they're skeptical about vaccine. If we're fortunate enough to have a vaccine that comes along that will effectively prevent sickness from COVID-19, there will be people who warn that it's too dangerous. They have a prejudice against vaccines generally. Well, already there's a risk that we won't be able to use the vaccine as comprehensively as we should. We need someone like Ben Franklin around to argue with his persuasive ways that a vaccine would be best for the American people. A fourth way that the Franklin biography speaks to the politics at stake as the nation confronts coronavirus. To illustrate that point, it's worth recalling the role he played, again, at the Constitutional Convention. He famously said that he was sent to the convention to consult, not to contend with each other, not to be a thorn in the side or be too contentious at the convention. Well, you probably all know that at the convention, one of the most sharply divided issues was how to apportion representation in Congress. Should it be apportioned by population or by parity among the states? Well, Franklin urged a compromise. He said, well, let's elect the House by population, let's have representatives to the House by population, and let's have representatives in the Senate represented by parity among the states. It wasn't his original idea. Someone else had suggested it early in the Constitutional Convention, but it had been shelved as not workable. Franklin dusted it off and proposed it. And when Franklin did it, people started to listen. And sure enough, that became the compromise. So what can you learn from that vignette? You can learn that Franklin had a way of reaching people that many others couldn't. He had already, in those days, he was seen as an honest broker, a wise, pragmatic man who could find solutions to thorny problems. And the delegates to the convention were willing to listen to Franklin and to accept his proposal for a compromise, partly for that reason. So again, you can ask, where are the Ben Franklins today? The people who can bridge the sharp divide we have, partisan divide, red-blue state divide, and so on in the country. We could use another Ben Franklin. So I'm going to close with one last story, which really, for me, exemplifies very well this pragmatism that Franklin brought to all things. So the story is on a voyage to Franklin and a voyage to Boston. Franklin was in a small boat with other people, and he developed a powerful hunger. He was really, really hungry. There wasn't food on this boat. Well, some of his mates on the boat caught some cod off Block Island, and they were frying it, and Franklin smelled this fish frying, and it smelled awfully good. So as he wrote in his autobiography, when the fish, and at this time, I should say, Franklin was a vegetarian. As a young man, he was still a vegetarian. But he writes in his autobiography, when the fish were opened, I saw smaller fish taking out of their stomachs and thought, hey, if you can eat one another, I don't see why I may not eat you. And from that experience, he teased out this observation, which is also in his autobiography. So convenient a thing to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to find or make a reason for everything one has a mind to do. Okay, well, those are the thoughts I wanted to share with you. Thank you for listening, and I'd be pleased to hear your questions and comments.
Joseph, thank you so much. Great job. Do have some questions in the chat. A few of these were sent to me privately, so they may not appear to everyone. So one viewer suspects that Benjamin Franklin was not very religious. Was he, and why or why not?
Well, he said he believed in God. He wasn't religious in an institutional way. He didn't attend church very much. And he contributed. He thought churches were worthwhile and much of what they do, and he contributed generously to various churches, especially in Philadelphia. But his religious views were complex. He basically didn't believe in a God that would influence human events in any way. So he was, I guess you'd say, sort of an agnostic when it comes to religion, but he supported it nonetheless and as a charitable matter.
Another question, what was Ben a apprentice in? You said he had an apprenticeship?
Yeah, so he was apprenticed to his brother James, who was a printer, and that's how he learned the printing trade. He was there for 5 years working for James, and he was a very good printer. You may think of him as kind of a portly guy. A lot of the images of Franklin show him in old age, balding and portly, and not made of very stern stuff. But actually, he was quite as a young man. He was quite barrel-chested and quite a strong guy, because in those days, the lead type. No, I guess I'm sorry. It was wooden type. The wooden type was in boxes, and you had to cart all this type around, and he could do that with no trouble. So that's the kind of thing he learned, and to set type and to print. when he worked for James as an apprentice.
A couple of these questions I think you answered sort of after they were asked. I will ask Nancy's, why do you think Ben preferred ambassadorship to running for Congress?
Well, so he died in 1790, and he was quite old and incapacitated in the years before he died. He had a number of ailments, and he barely was able to attend the Constitutional Convention. So I think he was glad to be back in Philadelphia, back in his own home, and glad to be able to rest and recover from these many ailments. I don't think he was in any physical condition to go to, well, in those days, the original Congress was in Philadelphia and then later in Washington, but I don't think he thought he was in any condition to do that. And also, I don't know, I'm not sure he saw himself playing that role. I mean, he'd already played the role in such other distinguished ways that maybe running for Congress wouldn't have been appealing to him, but that's speculation on my part. I think most of all, he was just an old man then. He was really too old. And he died at 84, and by the time you were in your 80s in the 18th century, you were considered very old, really old. Few people survive that long.
So Joseph, we'll take a couple more questions because we're coming up on 8 o'clock. Lauren wants to know, Franklin seems to have left Boston on not so very good terms. What were his feelings towards his hometown? You mentioned that he left money upon his death.
Yeah, so I think in the early days, he wanted to avoid not only Boston, but his brother, James, because he'd stiffed his brother and he'd broken the terms of his apprenticeship. He asked his father, once he was ready to set up a printing business of his own, asked his father to stake him for the money that he needed to start the business. His father didn't have enough confidence in him to do that. So I think his family relations weren't the best in the early days, but I think he was grateful to Boston for having launched him as well as it did. And I think he had, well, if you read the autobiography, you'll see he had fond memories of his boyhood in Boston. And I think because it was his birthplace, his native city, and because in later years he went back to Boston, and his favorite sister, Jane, was living there, and he had good relations with her, I think he developed more of an affection for Boston, and I think that's why he chose Boston as one of the two recipients of this trust funds.
All right, and I think the last question is going to Andrew, who asks a great question, because I'm often referred to Joseph as a jack of all trades, but master of none. Ben Franklin was a jack of all trades and a master of many. Andrew wants to know, how was Ben able to master so many disciplines with only 2 years of formal education?
Well, he was self-educated. He was incredibly disciplined. He read everything he could get his hands on for a long time. And he had enormous stamina and endurance to learn things. I mean, he taught himself all various foreign languages. He wasn't bad in French, even though when he arrived in Paris in 1776, he knew virtually no French. He was just devoted to learning, and he overcame a lack of education. And also, some people, I think, rightly refer to him as a genius. There are not many people who come along with his sheer brain power, and so I think that's part of it. He was. It's interesting that he was. He dropped out of. His father didn't continue to pay for his school for a variety of reasons. One reason is Ben wasn't very good at math, so he was taking math in the first couple of years of his schooling, and he had trouble with math. But nonetheless, think of what he managed to achieve as a scientist. In spite of rudimentary math, he tried to teach himself math, but he never really mastered math. So he was just, he was driven and determined to succeed, and he taught himself constantly everything he could possibly learn.
Well, Ben Franklin and I have something in common. Neither of us have mastered math. So there we go. And on that note, 3 quick things, folks. Number 1, we have a talk on Teddy Roosevelt tomorrow night, another one of my favorite American icons, Teddy Roosevelt, tomorrow night, 7 o'clock. Also tomorrow morning at 8 a.m., you're going to be receiving an email. Check your inbox. It will have a feedback survey. Want to know what you thought of tonight's program. Also want to know what you'd like to see for future programs. And also in that email, you'll be able to subscribe to our program email newsletter that comes out every Sunday and tells you everything that's coming up at the library for that week. And the third thing I want to do very quickly is allow you all the opportunity to say thank you to Joseph. So on 3, I'm going to unmute everyone. And on 3, we're going to say thank you, Joseph. Okay, so on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Thanks, Joseph. That was great.
That was great.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. We had around 35 folks or so. That was a pretty good turnout. We'll take it. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Joseph. I'll communicate via email with you, Joseph. So thank you all so much for coming. Have a great night.
No, we're not going to.
Take care.
Hope to see you at a future program. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Yep. Have a